think we're going to be okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start the stream.
Okay.
So stream is on. Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lorin Flores. I'm so excited to be here with our special guest, Elizabeth Bolander. Also, we have Cindy DeLeon, one of my colleagues. She's going to be moderating as well. So I'd like to quickly just introduce the program. This is Readers Advisory Hour, and today we're going to be talking about inclusive disability reads for adults. We're going to talk about nonfiction and fiction novels. We will actually be reviewing about 6 of them, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion about just the concept of disabilities and how they're portrayed in literature. And so I'd like to hand it over to Cindy really quickly so that she can introduce our special guest, who is from New Mexico. Very excited and wonderful to have you here, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Lorin. Nice to have you, Elizabeth. Just a few things about Elizabeth Bolander. Elizabeth Bolander is a teacher of students with visual impairments in New Mexico. She works mainly with students who have an eligibility of multiple impairments, including a visual impairment. Elizabeth is also the mother of a child with an eligibility of autism spectrum disorder. Therefore, she has experience with the special education system from both the parent side and the teacher side. Elizabeth's research interests lie in the field of people with differing abilities having access to all the same opportunities as those who do not have additional needs. She is currently working on a project that deals with workplace technology being accessible to people with visual impairments. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I'm so excited to be discussing these books today and talking about people with differing abilities. So thank you for having me.
Great.
Oh, great. Yes. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. So I wanted to double check really quickly. I should be sharing my screen. Do y'all see the slide up?
I don't see the slide.
So it's not up yet. Okay, that's okay as well. What I'm thinking is I'd like to go ahead and ask Elizabeth to start. She actually has this really wonderful, it's called a concept map. It's from an article that she reviewed, I guess, a month or so ago. It really does a good job of explaining the different concepts when we're talking about literature. And so I believe this particular article focuses more on young adult literature, but I think a lot of it applies to adult literature as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth really quickly so she can explain the concepts that we'll be talking about.
Okay, so can you see this concept map here? Is it showing? Okay, so when we have literature that we can have the normalcy narratives, which are narratives that don't usually include people with disabilities in them, but sometimes they do. But when they do include people with disabilities, they're often didactic or condescending or pedantic. I'm trying to see if I can get my pointer. Let's do my pointer. Okay, is that showing up there? Okay, so and these normalcy narratives reinforce the dominant cultural models, such as able-bodied as being desirable and disability as a sort of a problem. And these normalcy narratives have disabled characters that must either be normalized or removed from the literature. And these normalcy narratives result in internalization of normalcy narratives and also oppressive representations, where people with disabilities are seen as other, or disability is seen as an individual pathology in need of rehabilitation. So something that needs to be fixed instead of something that we can celebrate as a difference. And the normalcy narratives also result in restrictive representations, such as those with disabilities seen as needing protection or as needing care. And then these normalcy narratives shape cultural representations of power and agency and identity. On the other hand, we can challenge these normalcy narratives with disability counter narratives. And disability counter narratives act to give students with disabilities or people with disabilities the opportunity to see their experience represented. And they also act to expand options for depicting disability. And they open up introspection for all students about their own identities, not just students with disabilities, but students with any kind of difference who may feel marginalized. They can identify with the way that the character feels also. And disability counter-narratives encourages readers to have self-empowerment, and we'll see that in a lot of the stories that we're going to discuss today, and then self-discovery, the way that we discover who we are and how we become the people that we want to be, and encourages readers to consider a problem and its complexity. So life is not simple. There's a lot of different people and a lot of different ways to view things. And so this can lead to questioning assumptions about what it means to be able-bodied and who gets to define identity in general. So is it others that get to define your identity, or is it yourself that gets to identify your identity? And the others that are included in many of the stories that we're talking about here are friends and society and institutions and family. So there are a variety of others in our lives that we may not even think are influencing us. And then the last thing is that these disability counter narratives lead us to question assumptions about binary oppositions in society, such as rich and poor, abnormal and normal, gay and straight. There's a lot of things that we see as binary, but which really aren't binary things. And I think we're starting to open up a little bit about binary not being the way things need to be. And so we're seeing that in our disability counter narratives, as well as other areas in our lives and in the way people identify themselves.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful. I think this is really, for me at least, especially when I was reading the books that we're going to review, I found it very, very helpful to have the vocabulary to describe what I was reading and seeing. So I really do appreciate that. And let me go ahead and I'm going to share my screen. So y'all please let me know if it does not pop up, but hopefully you should see discussion question number 1. So do y'all see that okay?
Yes. Yes,
Fabulous.
I can see that.
Okay. And what I did is I put the citation to the article that Elizabeth diagrammed. So that way, if folks want to go back and actually look it up, you can go to the library databases and you can look up this article if you'd like to read it. And I think that, and again, I want to thank Elizabeth for the introduction because that helps bring us into our discussion question number 1. So what does deficit narrative and othering mean when speaking about literature featuring characters with disability?
Yeah, and I think like we were talking about with the normalcy narratives, there is this deficit idea in the normalcy narratives that somehow someone with a disability or even anyone who has a difference that is recognized, that is somehow a deficit, a bad thing, a pathology, something that needs to be corrected or needs to be fixed. And those disability counter narratives, they say that, wait a minute, why do we need to fix something? Why is this a bad thing? So for example, I'm a teacher of students with visual impairments, and a lot of people think, oh, well, you know, if only we could help these students to see better. Well, why is it bad to not be able to see? Then you just have different modes of learning. So instead of reading print, you can be a Braille reader. And that isn't in any way negative or something that needs to be fixed. It's just a different way of doing things. Or if someone had a hearing impairment or is deaf, they would use sign language. And so those things are not somehow inferior. They're just a different way of doing things. And that's what disability counter narratives seek to show, that there are different ways of doing things that are just as good. They're just not what people are normally used to seeing.
That makes sense. And I was going to add, because I think you made the point, maybe not in this session, but maybe in a different session when you were speaking about this topic, is it seems that a lot of the characters, at least that I've seen in the past, when they have a disabled character in the novel, they have this kind of tragic, it's like they put them in these pre-made storylines. They're almost like a stereotype. And it seems like what we were really going for when we were choosing these books was to try to find books that are outside of those stereotypical or, depictions, as you mentioned. So
Yes, and like we were saying with the normalcy narratives, a lot of times we want to take a character that has a different ability, a differing ability, and we want to say that they need to be protected or cared for. And that is a form of othering. And even though it's good for us all to care for each other and all to protect each other, I mean, as human beings, we want to do that. But to say that a person who has neurodiversity or a different kind of ability is somehow inferior and needs the care more than any other person. Now, that is not something that we want to perpetuate in our literature to people, because we want people to see that just because someone is different doesn't mean that they have some sort of problem. It's not a problem, it's just a difference. And I think a lot of the books, like you were saying, Lorin, really the ones that we're reviewing, they really showed that people can be different and still, and we can see that they're more the same as us than they are different when we're, as a reader, reading the book.
I agree. And I felt that one of the things that I really value about reading the books that we've chosen because of the disability counter narrative is it's amazing to be able to get a first person perspective and just understand how, how the world is experienced in different ways. It's just really, I thought it was very eye-opening. So
yeah, and it's interesting because the two of the books that I read were from a first person perspective, and then the book Wonder, which I think a lot of people have probably read because it's pretty mainstream, and like my son had to read it in school, and that one came from a few different perspectives, including a first person perspective from the main character who has a physical difference, but they also had first person perspective from other characters. And that was interesting to see how other people perceived the disability, or how other people interacted and how their lives were affected by somebody else's physical difference.
That's really interesting. And if I remember correctly, I mean, I know that the three books that I read are all nonfiction and they are memoirs. So just to kind of let the audience know, we are going to go and alternate with the books that we read. We read jointly 6 in total. And so my 3 are Sick by Porochista Khakpour, also The Pretty One by, and I'm blanking out on her name, but I'm going to have a picture of the book in a moment so y'all will see. And then also, let's see, it would be Laughing at My Nightmare by Shane Burcaw. And so those 3 are all first person memoirs, and they're really interesting. And I think yours, Elizabeth, I think you had like a fiction work, and you just mentioned Wonder. And are the other 2 also memoirs as well?
I had 2 fiction and 1 memoir. Yeah.
That's great. So I'd like to go ahead and jump into the part where we talk about all the books that we read. And I wanted to check in with Cindy. Is there anybody in chat right now?
Well, Nick has chimed in to say hello, but he hasn't asked a question yet. But hello,
Okay.
Nick.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just let us know, Nick, if you have any questions. We're going to start our review of the books. And again, if there are any other folks that are on chat and have a question, you're welcome to ask. Cindy is going to relay the questions to us, and so that way we can answer them. So let me go ahead and pull up the first one. And this is one that Elizabeth read.
Yeah, this book is a fiction book, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And in this book, it's kind of like a murder mystery, but involving a dog instead of a human murder mystery. And the main character is not identified as having a specific differing ability, but as you read it, you, or at least I, identified the main character as having an autism spectrum disorder. And so for me, this book was incredibly insightful because my son has also been he has an eligibility of an autism spectrum disorder. And so a lot of the things that this main character does and a lot of his thinking patterns are so similar to my own son. And I know it's kind of like the saying goes, if you know one person who has autism, then you know one person with autism. You don't, because there's so much diversity in that neurodiversity. And so it was just interesting that there were so many similarities between this main character and between my son too. For the structure of the book, it was really also very interesting because the structure of the book is such that the chapters are done as prime numbers, because prime numbers is something that is important to this main character. And so instead of them being like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, it was like chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 5, chapter 7, following prime numbers. And I'm not even sure if I got all those prime numbers correctly in order, but so even the structure of the book, which I always love when there's something quirky like that in a book. And I'm sure, Lorin, you pick up on those things too and find them interesting.
Yeah, I know that it was made into a play. And so one of the things that I was curious about is how they would translate. And that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you. How do you think that they might translate that? Or, you know, they did it already, but I'm just kind of curious how that would work, you know, from reading the book, if you can imagine it as a play.
I love going to see plays. I haven't seen that play, but like I can totally see how that could be a play because the characters are so distinct and there aren't a whole lot of characters and there aren't a whole lot of different scenes. So I could see like his house is a scene and his school is a scene. And so this main character goes to a school that is a segregated school for people who have differing abilities. And so he is segregated from his general education peers, which is not something that is common right now in the United States, but it used to be very common. And in fact, used to be the only way that people with differing abilities could have an education. So it wasn't so long ago that that was the way things were done. And so that's very interesting that they made it into a play because it really does lend itself to that. I can see that in the way the characters interact.
That sounds great. I mean, I would love to see it too. So
yeah,
this sounds like a wonderful book. So what would you rate it? A plus?
Oh
A?
yeah, I would say so. Yes, it was one of those ones I couldn't put down. I really loved. But this was the only book of mine that the main character had a disability that was not something that was a physical impairment that you could see, that someone would recognize immediately on sight. The other two characters in the other books I read, one was in a wheelchair, and then the other had a facial abnormality. And so that was interesting because it's sometimes when people have a disability that you can't see, like a neurodiversity, they are treated differently from someone who maybe has just a physical disability. And so there were some differences in the way that this character was treated as opposed to the way that the other characters were treated in the other books I read. So I don't know about your books, Lorin. What were yours centered on?
Well, it's interesting because when you mentioned, you know, like an invisible quote unquote disability, the book that I read that I was going to talk about first is called Sick, and she does have Lyme disease. And so it's about her experiences with it. And so it seems like at the beginning, in a way, it is a type of invisible disability in a sense because she's ill and she has a lot of really weird effects. I didn't ever realize how severe Lyme disease was until I read this book and all the different neurological problems that it causes. I mean, apparently it really wreaks havoc on people's memory, on their functioning. It causes extreme fatigue. It can cause other really seemingly unrelated problems. And so it seemed like the very beginning part was her struggling for a diagnosis. at the end, I guess in a way she is a bit more visible in the sense that the disease progresses so much that she ends up having to use a cane because it starts to have like a physical effect. But I thought it was really interesting because this particular book is very, very literary. She's a writer. That's what she does. And it's also really interesting too, because it seems almost like a chronicle of her life being interrupted by this huge flare and then a relapse that happened. And so there's a lot of really good layers in here. She is an immigrant from Iran. Her parents left during the revolution, and so she does talk about aspects of when you're having like a health crisis and just the different fears that she had because especially nowadays there's a lot of open bigotry and things like that. And so she was really concerned about how people would react because, she would call her parents and they'd be speaking in Farsi and she would tell people, look, I'm not doing anything. I'm trying to get a ride, because a lot of what she talks about at the beginning is just her struggle to be able to get transport to and from places because it was basically causing it so that she was having blackouts and things like that. So she wasn't really able to drive. And so a lot of it is, just the business of trying to make a living and work, because she was also a faculty member at several different universities. And so she was also just having a really long journey trying to get the correct diagnosis. And so she's talking about that. And then she also describes the time periods in terms of her relationships with different partners. And so it's not a really huge part of the book. I mean, it does form the basis of several chapters, but it's interesting as well because she is talking about going through this ordeal with several different partners and having to manage things. So it's just, I thought it was like a really, really fascinating book. And also when she's discussing just her body and how she has to, the way she describes it is, it's her body and, having to understand or trying to understand the processes that are going on. So I thought it was really, really vivid. And again, with some of the other books that I read, they were a little more conversational, and this one really read kind of like a serious piece of literature. So I thought it was fascinating in that respect.
Oh, and I have some questions now.
Okay.
So I have Nathan Bolander. I have a feeling he's related to our speaker. And his question is, when we say bad, are people discussing more of a poor quality of life for people who have different abilities? Or when they say, we're saying that disability is bad, I think. Is that what they mean, or?
I think a lot of people do have that that mentality that people with differing abilities have somehow a lesser quality of life, when that really isn't the case. I mean, everyone has a different life situation, a different life scenario. And so for us to try to judge the quality of life that someone else has is really a difficult thing. But I think there is that perception that if someone can't do the same things as another person, that somehow their life is not as full or as rich. But I don't think that's the case at all. There's a lot of things that I have to do that I would rather not do, that if I didn't have to do, I wouldn't do. And so I think there's a lot of misconception. And I think that kind of othering takes place in all sorts of arenas. And it isn't just in the arena of physical impairments or what someone can do physically, but in just all sorts of things. We may think someone living in another country has a poor quality of life because of the kind of housing that they have isn't the same as what we have, but their housing may have some wonderful things about it that we have never even thought of, because we're so used to what we have and what we see and what we do. And so I think that kind of othering is so common in our mentality that it's hard to get away from.
Yes. And I have a question from Nick also. This is more for about a curious incident of the other book. And he asked, how did the character from Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime get segregated from his peers?
They made it seem in the book as if all students with differing abilities in his region were sent to this special school. So he had a bus that picked him up and would go and pick up the other students who had differing abilities. And he also seemed to be one of the students who didn't have as severe needs as some of the other students, because one of the main plot points in the book is that he's taking what they call his A levels, which I guess is the equivalent maybe of SAT here in America. I'm not really sure exactly what our equivalent would be to that test, but that it was something exceptional at his school for someone to be taking these A-level exams. And so it seemed that and I don't know if it's because of the region he was living in, that they didn't have enough teachers in a school that wasn't segregated to meet his needs. But it seemed that everyone in that area who had a differing ability was sent to this segregated school.
Thank you.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you. So I was going to move on to Wonder, because I'm very curious about this book. I haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, so I'm curious to hear your take on it.
Yeah, the first time I heard about this book, actually, my son had to read it last year, and it was part of his reading program for his school. So they pick a series of different books throughout the year, and all the students have to read them. And a lot of them are kind of counter-narrative books, which I really appreciated that the school wanted to have these conversations. And so this was the disability counter-narrative book, the only one that he read last year. And so this one is about a boy who's in 5th grade, and he has a cranial facial abnormality. And so he's had, I think it was like 27 surgeries to fix, and it was based on a true story, although it's fictionalized. This book is fictionalized. And so it begins from his perspective, and then it shifts to different people in his life from their perspective, I really enjoyed that different perspective throughout the book. And each chapter was very, very short. So I felt like it was a really good read for young adults. And for my son was in 7th grade when he read it. And I think you could probably even go down to 5th grade and read this because of the level of it. And so throughout the book, there isn't really like the Curious Incident book that had like a real plot, and you were trying to figure something out and things happened that were sequential. This book wasn't like that. It was more talking about the interactions that this boy has over his first year of going to a school. He had been homeschooled previously, and this was his first year of attending in school. So it was that part, that it wasn't like things happened sequentially and you were waiting to find out what happened next. That part was different. That made the book different. But it was so interesting to see how the people in his life were affected by his physical difference.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So, and I mean, I know that a lot of folks will read, like adults will read young adult books. So do you think that adults would probably enjoy this book as well?
Oh, yes, definitely. And I think it deals a lot with the bullying aspect. And that is so prevalent now in our society that I think everyone needs to read more about bullying and find out more about how bullying affects children. And so I think for anyone to better understand that whole idea of the bullying, and that it's a great read for that. And then just also to understand how people feel when you other them, when you treat them as something different, or when you stare at them, or when you call them a name, and even if you don't mean it in a mean way, we just have to be so conscious of how we treat each other, that this book really can bring to light a lot of the feelings that come up in a person when they are othered.
That sounds, I mean, that sounds really amazing. I'm definitely going to read. I really want to read this book. So,
yeah. And you know, like the fiction books are kind of like you were talking about Sick, and how it was more of a Sick was more of a heavier read. And this is like a lighter read, even though it deals with heavy topics. And I think that's why it's so good for the young adults, is because it, or even children, is because it takes something that's really heavy, and then but it lightens it because of the style of writing and because of the interaction of the characters.
that sounds, I mean, as I said, I really want to read this book. I was going to ask Cindy really quickly as well. Do we have any comments or questions so far?
So far, let's check. I just had those comments that I shared with you already from Nick and Nathan, but nothing new.
Okay.
Since,
Well, and again, just to encourage folks, if you're out there and you have any questions, please don't be shy. And also, if you want to tell us about a book or recommend a book or make a comment on the books that we're talking about, that would be fabulous too. So let me go ahead. And is it okay, Elizabeth? I wasn't sure if you were done with, talking about Wonder, or if you'd like to add some extra things.
I might add some stuff later as we talk, but no, go on. Let's hear about your next book, Lorin.
Got it. So, and I felt terrible for blanking out on her name, but this is Keah Brown, and she wrote a book called The Pretty One. And it's really fascinating because one of the things that I've been really interested in, of course, lately is social media. And so she had a hashtag that she started using in 2017, and it became a kind of a sensation, and it caused her to have a lot of kind of like a platform. So the hashtag is disabled and cute. So hashtag disabled and cute. And so this is really interesting because it's like a collection of essays. And so it does talk about her life. But what I thought was really enjoyable about this particular book is it's, lighthearted. I mean, especially compared to the book that I read before, which was Sick. But there's a lot of really good content and commentary. And one of the things that I think is really helpful and interesting is she does talk about just disability rights as being connected. She really explicitly kind of connects it to the civil rights movement. She talks about intersectionality, which I think is really wonderful because a lot of times I think people don't quite understand what that means. And I thought she had a really wonderful explication and discussion about how it works, and also just in the context of her life and things like that. And so I thought that was really fabulous. She was talking a little bit about just some of the other things that she sees. Like she was talking about, misogyny, but she was also talking about just, the race and ethnic aspect of that, because she was talking about how, there's also elements of, she called it misogynoir, which was the first time that I'd seen that particular word, which is very, to me, very descriptive. And then I also thought it was interesting as well because she does talk about romantic love, and she does talk about the feeling of being othered. And I know that in the diagram that you presented, Elizabeth, there was a bit about, in normalcy narratives that they hold up able-bodied people as being desirable. And so she does talk about, she has, a narrative against that. And she does talk about the work that she did in the journey to basically liberate herself from that mindset that's being forced on her. And so it just, I really felt it was a really helpful book too, because she talks about her body and the different, like her relationship with her body, and having to unlearn a lot of the things that are aimed at her from society. And I really felt that it was very eye-opening as well, because she does talk about like the need, like when you're going out shopping, you know, she needs places where she can sit. And I know a lot of times people don't necessarily think in that way, but she talks about how, you know, when she does things, she's planning her outings. And so I think it's something that is helpful for us to know and understand. And it probably doesn't get written very much in some of the novels that we've seen that don't really have realistic depictions of people, of disabled people. And so I thought it was really, really a good read if y'all get a chance to read it. And I really I recommend it. So
it's interesting that you're talking about the way I love that hashtag disabled and cute. And in the next book that I'm going to discuss, which is the memoir from Judith Heumann, she also talks about how she did not know that she was pretty, that she didn't even find that out until she got around other people who were also had physical disabilities, and then she figured it out then. But when she had been in other scenarios where she was the only one in a wheelchair, she had felt very unpretty. And then when she realized that she was actually very attractive, it was like almost like a surprise to her, because she had not felt that way before. And I think it is this unrealistic expectation of women to have some sort of perfection. Like there's some sort of perfection we must meet in order to be considered pretty. And I'm reading this other book called Beauty Sick is just about how women are portrayed in the media, and how and social media and all sorts of media, and how we feel like we have to live up to this idea of like you can't even be it. It's impossible. And I know that's kind of going off on a tangent, but
no, it's interesting. I'm fascinated. So
because that othering takes place in so many different ways, and it doesn't need to even be about race or disability. It can just be any woman's body that isn't portrayed by social media as perfection, and perfection is impossible, you know. So
it's true.
Oh, I have some questions from our audience.
Excellent.
So Nathan wants to know, going back to the books we were discussing before, were there any perspectives from the Wonder book where people didn't know they were othering even though they had good intentions? And then I have another question after that.
Yes, absolutely. I think the biggest one is when people would stare. And I think that is something that happens a lot. People, when they see something that's different, they just stare. And in fact, one of my friends who has a visual impairment, in fact, she has no light perception, and she says she knows when people are staring at her. And I was like, well, how do you know when people are staring at you? It was interesting. And she said it's the way that they breathe.
Huh.
Yeah, they have a certain breathing pattern when they're staring at you. And so, like, I think that's a way people don't realize that they're doing it, but it is a form of othering someone, or not having a poor intention, but still making someone feel like they're different or like they don't belong somewhere. And so I think that's the most obvious one from Wonder, was the staring. And from
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, just like life in general, like from things my friends have said or things I've seen with students, that is something that is very common.
Yes. And so I have another question here. What are aspects of bullying? Can talking more about the aspects of bullying from the Wonder, maybe so.
Oh yeah, there are so many different parts to bullying. He does have one incident at the end of the book that's a pretty like flagrant bullying, where it's, you know, several kids involved, and there's physical bullying where things happen where he's hurt. And that I think happens less often than, although Yeah, I think it happens less often than things like cyberbullying, or when students are bullied on social media, or when they're stared at, or put things on their locker, or mean signs, or give them a note that says mean things. So I think there's so many ways that people can be bullied nowadays. And technology has kind of opened up and blossomed the way that we can be bullied, which, we can use technology for good, or we can use technology for evil. And so, of course, there's going to be some people who use it in a negative way. There are other parts of bullying that can be more subtle, such as just not being someone's friend, or telling others, oh, don't be so-and-so's friend because of their difference, because they may have a physical abnormality, or physical difference, or neurodiversity. And that happens in the Wonder Book also, that people try to get other students not to be friends with him because he's different. And so I think there are so many facets to bullying that we don't always consider. We often think of the physical part of it, someone getting beat up, after school or something. And while that does happen, certainly that does happen, I think that is less frequent than the other forms.
Yes, that's a good answer. Thank you. That is very helpful, because bullying can often be very subtle. Thank you.
So did we have any other questions? Or I accidentally advanced the slide, so I figured we could jump into the next one if there aren't any questions or anything.
No questions so far. Thank you. No more questions so far.
Thanks for the questions, guys. Great questions.
Great questions.
Next book that I read is called Being Human, and that's like a play on her last name, because her name is Judith Heumann. And so it's an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist. And Judith Heumann is a disability rights activist who worked really hard on, a large portion of the book is about the Section 504, getting that passed, getting the regulations for that written and passed, which were a huge win for all sorts of people with differing abilities. And the story starts off with her life as a little girl, and then how she was treated and how she felt, and then how she really did not have access to schooling for a long time when she was younger. And it seemed to be a lot of workarounds on how to not get her to be in the general education classroom. And so she is in a wheelchair because of polio. And so she talks a little bit about how being in a wheelchair affected her life, and how she wasn't able to go to school, and her mom really fought for her to have the right to go to school, and how she was offered things like a segregated school, and that just wasn't the right fit for her. And so I think sometimes a segregated school can be the right fit for some students, but for her, that wasn't the right fit. And for many of our students, I don't think it is. I think it's good to have access to your general education peers. So she talks about how she fought for a lot of the rights that we now have. And she just takes us through the process of what it was like to be picketing and to be protesting while having a physical disability, and some of the challenges that come along with that we don't think of normally, that would have an effect, but they really do have an effect. For example, when they were doing kind of like an occupation style of a building, they had to have attendants who could come in to help with some of the physical difficulties that people would have when they were trying to stay for several days in a building that wasn't designed for people with disabilities. So she talks about how that process was, and just how things could be more difficult when you have a physical disability, and how to fight for your rights, to have those things that those accommodations that should be for everybody, but even just the process of fighting for them was such a journey, such a physically demanding journey for people with those physical disabilities.
That makes sense. And so when, I guess the time period when she was active, was that in the 90s or before then, or?
She talks more about the 70s. The 70s is when she was, I mean, she was active in other things as well, other decades as well, and she's still active, but in the 70s was when 70s and 80s was this like the majority of that activism.
That makes sense. I was just curious. I know that in the book that I read, Brown talks about, I think there was like an important piece of legislation that was signed in 1991. And so she talks about that and a little bit about that. But I think that's fascinating though, because I know that there's so much of the legislative and activism that has happened to make things more equitable. And I just think it's amazing that, there's this memoir. And I feel terrible because I hadn't heard about her before I had seen this on this list. And so it's another thing that I really want to read.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too, Lorin, because I had heard her name before, but I didn't know her story. But that we don't hear a lot about the heroes of the disability rights movement, whereas we do know a lot about other civil rights movement heroes. We do know their names, we learn their names in school, but we don't know about disability rights activists, and we don't hear their names regularly in school. I think if you asked maybe a high schooler if they could name a civil rights activist, they probably couldn't name a disability activist. Maybe they could, and that would be really, really awesome if they could, but I don't think so. I know when I was in high school, I couldn't. And so I think that is a disservice to students because we want them to have this whole breadth of history. And if we're missing a piece of that, then we haven't given them the education that we should be giving them.
I agree. And especially because it almost feels like, I know there's a discussion of invisibility. It just feels like it's being elided or, discounted almost. And I agree with you. We really should try to learn more about the heroes of the disability rights movement.
Yes.
I agree.
So I'd like to go ahead should I go ahead and introduce mine? I mean, I wasn't sure if you'd like to talk a little bit more about this particular book or not, but I'm happy to talk about my last one. Okay. Oh, did we have a question?
We have some more questions. Yes. So this is from Nathan. Elizabeth, as a teacher and a parent, how has the current school system done well for disabled students, and where does it still have challenges? And I have another question after that.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of good intentions out there, and that the school system really does want to put students in the best educational scenario that they can be in and with the best teachers. But I think there is a lot of difficulty in doing so because there is a teacher shortage, at least here there is, and especially in special education, there's a teacher shortage. And so we do get a lot of newer teachers who don't have a whole lot of experience. And with working with students with disabilities and students with differing abilities, it's so important to have experience, and that takes time to build. And the support systems sometimes aren't there for those teachers too. And I think, no one is immune to budget cutbacks and to bureaucracy. And I think that there is quite a bit of that still. So I think the teachers all do have good intentions and the districts do have good intentions, but when it comes into practice, there is some difficulty in getting students the best education possible. And I think there is also some pushback, which I really have a problem with, from general education teachers to have an inclusive setting. It's like it's like they become scared. It's like a fearfulness of something that's different, that they're not accustomed to. And so their natural reaction is to want to say, no, I don't want that in my classroom. And even if the student with a differing ability comes in with an educational assistant, they still get treated in a way that, okay, well, I'm going to be teaching my class these things, and then your student is going to be doing something else over here. And that isn't right. If we want to have an inclusive atmosphere, and if we want to teach our students that everybody can contribute to the conversation, then we really need to be embracing different abilities. We need to be embracing different abilities, not only in those who are labeled with an eligibility, but also those students who are just different. I mean, there are so many ways to be different now. and it's good. It's good to be different. It's good to have a different perspective and to contribute to this diversity in our world. But I think often there's a fear of that pushes students away who should be included. And I think that that's one major way that we could improve in the school system.
Then I have another question, and Nick, you'll have to correct me in the chat if I get the question wrong, but he asks, what are the disability rights, I guess, discussed for the book being Human? What disability rights specifically does she discuss in there? I think that's how I understand the question.
Yeah, she discusses a whole bunch of things, but the main thing was a Section 504, which was allowing people to have access to the education and to have access to buildings, access to all sorts of things that students and people with disabilities had been excluded from, wheelchair ramps, anything that which can pave the way for the ADA, which was eventually what happened in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so there's so many things, and mainly what she's writing about is the regulations of the Section 504 and so those things, because there were no regulations written out, then there was really no implementation. So that happens a lot, where something can become a law and give people rights, but then if there's no regulations to say how that should be done, how that should be carried out, and then also no penalizing if it isn't done, then those things don't often get put into place. And so that was what was going on in that book, was that they were trying to get, there were so many of them, but yeah, there was a lot of rights that they were wanting as people who weren't given those rights before, that seemed like very basic rights.
Well, thank you. That's a very comprehensive answer. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That was really, I always learn a great deal. So let's see, are there any other questions, Cindy?
So far I don't see anything else. So that's the last question I saw. So
okay, so we'll go ahead and move on, and again, please just alert us if we have more questions. So let me move on to the next one, and this is the last one that I read. It's called Laughing at My Nightmare. The author is Shane Burcaw, and I thought that this was really interesting because he had apparently started a blog, I think it was on Tumblr in 2011. And so this book, I think, is a little bit older. It's from 2014. He had also started a foundation, but it reads more like a stand-up comedy routine. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of jokes that are interspersed. And I think that part of his storytelling style is to make it very humorous. He has spinal muscular atrophy, and so he's been in a wheelchair since he was 2. And so he does talk about his childhood, just the effects of the condition that he has, and also just when, he went to school, because it sounds like he went, in a school where he wasn't segregated. And it sounded like he grew up in a smallish town and he had cousins that he was really close to. So it sounds like he had a lot of family support. One of the things that I think is interesting about this particular book is it does not shy away from sexual topics, which I know that sometimes when you read memoirs, they tend to maybe avoid it or not talk about it very frankly. And so I thought that that was one of the things that made it unique. And also, I think that his style of writing, because he really focuses on the everyday experiences of his life and the processes that he does that to basically, eat, to go to the bathroom, things like that. And so it's a really interesting perspective. It sounds like also that he had some depression that he talks about, and that he really did feel great many times that people were othering him. And so he talks about, I think, a lot of the process and the feelings of that. But I think it's a really entertaining read. And also he does have his blog. So it's interesting to go in and look and see, just to kind of see what he and his wife were doing on social media. So.
Oh, that sounds cool. I would like to check that out too. I love it. Yeah, it doesn't shy away from the sexual topics, because I think there is this mentality out there that people with disabilities are somehow asexual. And that is such a strange mentality that I don't know where it comes from, but I have heard people have that mentality. And so I think it's good to read about and to understand that as our bodies develop, we all are sexual, and people aren't not included in that just because they're different from another person. Like, a difference doesn't mean that someone's asexual. And so I love that he talks about that. I gotta check that out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I mean, he talks about dating, and I believe Keah Brown also talks about dating. It's just, she's maybe not as, I would say, blunt in her discussion, but it's very fascinating too, because you get to see different cultures as well. And I think his family, I got the impression that they're, from like maybe the Northeast, maybe possibly. And so it's been really interesting to read a variety of books from different viewpoints and just see the different cultures at play and different regionalities and things like that. So did you catch any of that in the novels that you read, Elizabeth?
Yeah, I like the intersectionality too. There is like a difference in the way that people act and think in like the Northeast versus the South, and then one of them was in England, so that was different too. And so yeah, I think there are some regional things and cultural things that take place in intersection with disability.
Okay. Well, it says, how are people with disabilities asexual? Or I guess, did you want to answer that question?
I did not mean to say that they are asexual. I think that people, I don't know if anyone is actually asexual. I think we are sexual beings, and I think that they are other people to say that they are asexual when they aren't asexual. They want to date. Everyone wants to have someone special in their life, and people want to make a physical connection. And so regardless of any physical disability or neurodiversity, that people are not asexual. So I think that it's just that when there are people, that's just something that I read, and especially Judith Heumann had said things like that she wanted to date, she wanted to do those things, and how much it hurt her when she wasn't seen as someone that would want to be out on a date. She had a little vignette where she was saying she was in her room one night in college, and someone came, knocked on the door and said, "Would you know any girls who might want to go out on a double date? Because someone backed out of a double date." And she's sitting there like, what about me? Like, I'm a girl sitting here in my room, and so the fact that he didn't even see her as someone who would want to be going out on a date with him or with his friend, the fact that he didn't even see her that way was a way that he was making her asexual, not having her in even the pool of girls he would consider to come out on this double date with him. And so that can be very hurtful, just to be seen in a way where you're not seen as a sexual being.
Do you think that's a form of invisibility?
Oh yeah, Cindy, that's a great way of putting it. I think that's probably exactly how Judith Heumann felt. She felt invisible in terms of being someone who would be eligible to be dating. Yeah, she felt invisible.
I was just going to add, in Keah Brown's book, she has a twin sister. And so, yeah, Cindy's a twin. I hope it's okay for me to mention that on stream. Yeah. So, but, she does talk about, when her sister, when they were in high school and they started, meeting people, and people would go and ask Keah about her sister, Leah, hey, tell your sister that I like her, or something like that. And she would feel very envious and kind of angry. And she does talk about using online dating services and how people react to different profiles. And it didn't sound like she really cared for it very much, but she really does talk a lot about how she really, really does hope to find a romantic relationship. And it was like, I think, a basis of a chapter. So I thought that was a really interesting perspective. And I think with Shane, with him, he was more, trying things out. And he again, he's very frank about sexual things like that. So he talks a little bit about just some of his feelings in that area, and just some of the experiences that he had.
It sounds like he's very frank and very open.
He is, and it's very entertaining. So I think that if you read the book, you'll really enjoy it, because, again, he has like a very distinct way of writing. And I think it's also interesting as well, because he talks about some of the physical, I guess, issues that he deals with. And just, it's fascinating to hear about, just like his daily life and things like that. So
that does sound very, very interesting.
I was going to ask too, do we have any other questions so far?
No, that's the only questions I see. That's the only questions I see from our audience. Let me see. There might have been some other questions. Let me see. My computer just timed out. Did you have any questions, Lorin, in general, or discussion questions? I know you had mentioned them.
Yeah, we did have one that we can talk a little bit about. Where can I learn more about the genre theme? And so I was just going to kind of open it up. I know that Cindy often has some really good places for readers advisory. What would you recommend?
Well, starting with novelists, and Goodreads is very good, just the basic places. Also, there's some good resources out of Austin. There's an Inspire. I think I can't remember the names of the organizations that do put out different anthologies and things like that. There is a publisher that I'm might be presenting with us this month. He has a publishing house called let's see, I think it's called OLEB Books, OLEB Books, and he champions writers with disabilities. It identifies disabled, and that's one place to look. It's called the OLEB Books, OLEB Books. So that's where I
That's
go
great.
for. That's one of my sources.
That's really helpful.
Mhm.
So anyone else want to add anything? I mean, I was looking online and there's a lot of, I know that like on Goodreads, there's a book list. I'd seen an article on Book Riot. So I tend to look online to find different sites for recommendations and things like that. But my guess is as well as it sounds like, you know, if you go to Novelist, which is a database, that sounds really great.
Yes, it is a very good novel, and you can always email us at our webpage at www.mysapl.org to get recommendations from us like this as well. So.
Right. And actually, I'm going to stop sharing really quickly and I'm going to pull up the webpage so we can show that really quickly. And I'm looking at the time and it looks like we're actually past time. So do we have any other questions from the audience before we wrap up?
I don't see any more questions. No, unfortunately, no.
Well, this has been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for coming and being part of the event, Elizabeth. It was really great. It was wonderful to hear your insights and just the discussion, especially at the beginning where you were showing us your CMAP. I think it was really, really helpful because, again, it gives us a good overview of the different issues involved and just how things are in the state of well, it was young adult literature, but also just in adult literature as well.
Well, I can't wait to start reading those books.
Yeah, I can't wait to read some of the ones that you read, Lorin, and have more discussions about them.
Yeah, so, and again, we do have them listed on the link. So if folks want to actually search for those books, and I'm just going to show everybody really, really quickly, even though we're past time. But let me just quickly show the screen so y'all can see the library's webpage. So hopefully y'all should see that. And you can just go do a quick search. I'll just put in Wonder. And some of the books that we have are online. If you find a book that isn't online, we do have contact-free service. So you can put a hold on a book that you want, and then you can come and pick up the book at the library when it's ready. So just to let y'all know that there is a Wonder, and we have several different formats that are available. So let me go ahead and stop sharing the screen, and I'm going to close out the stream. Again, I wanted to thank all of our audience. Thank you for attending. Thank you again, Elizabeth. This was a really wonderful discussion. We really appreciate your expertise. I learned a great deal, and I'm sure everybody that was watching learned as well. I also wanted to thank Cindy as well for moderating and for watching the chat and relaying questions.
Well, thank you. It was a very, very enjoyable evening. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to say good night, and we're going to sign out.
Good
Goodbye,
night.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.